I'd like to wish you good morning and welcome everyone to the 20th meeting in 2013 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. If I could just remind everyone present to please turn off any mobile phones, tablets or other electronic devices. And I'd also like this opportunity to take this opportunity to welcome our new Independent Budget Advisor, Angela Scott, to our first committee meeting. Welcome, Angela. And also our new member of the clerking staff, Catherine Cairns, also to the committee. So welcome, Catherine. The first item on the agenda is to decide whether to take items 3 and 4 in private. Are members agreed? Members have indicated their agreement. And the second item of business today is to take evidence on implementation of the provisions of the Scotland Act 2012 and on the implications of the 2013 spending round for Scotland. Can I therefore welcome to the meeting the Right Honourable Danny Alexander MP, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and Paul Doyle, Devolved Countries Unit of HM Treasury. Now, I understand that the Cabinet Secretary, the Chief Secretary, I should say, has a flight to catch, and his evidence session will therefore have to be concluded no later than 10:30. I was going to invite the Chief Secretary to make a brief opening statement, but I understand that he has decided to waive that.
The time, I think it's better for the time to be taken up with the committee's questions, so I'll waive that right to get down to the meat of it.
Okay, that's great. That gives the committee more time for questions, so which we'd certainly appreciate. So I intend to address both topics separately. We'll focus initially for the first hour or so on the implementation of the Scotland Act, and I will ask members to ask questions on that first. And after we've exhausted questions on the Scotland Act, we will then move on to the impact of the recent spending round on Scotland, and I'll invite members to ask questions on this subject. So, in the usual fashion, before I open questions out to members of the committee, I shall ask some questions myself. So first of all, I just want to ask a question on the Scottish rate of income tax, Chief Secretary, which is basically following the evolution of SRIT, there will be a transitional period of around 2 or 3 years, and the UK Government will bear the risk of any deviation in outturn from the forecast. I'm just wondering what the effect would be if the Scottish Parliament agrees to an SRIT either above or below 10 pence in the pound. For example, if the Parliament agrees to a rate of 11 pence and there is no reconciliation to outturn receipts from the forecast.
Firstly, Mr Chairman, thank you very much for inviting me here today. And it's a very important subject in terms of the implementation of the Scotland Act. And I think that it's fair to say that we're making very good progress, particularly on the Scottish rate of income tax. The answer to your question is that the UK Government in the transition period bears the risks of deviation from the forecast, but if the Scottish Parliament chose to adjust the rate of income tax, then the amount of money passed over would be adjusted, reflecting if they decided to increase the rate from 10 pence to 11 pence, let's say, an amount equivalent to the additional revenue would be transferred in that transition period. Equally, if they chose to reduce the rate, say to 9p, the amount handed over would be reduced by an equivalent amount.
Right. Okay. Now, right. Okay. I don't think that's quite. Is that right? I mean, I would have thought that the adjustment would be the same, and therefore, what would actually happen is that if we decided to charge a higher rate, then the Scottish Parliament would get the extra money, and if we reduced the rate, then the money that came to the Scottish Parliament would reduce by the equivalent amount.
That's exactly what I said. I think. Apologies if I wasn't clear, but I think we mean the same thing.
Right. So, okay. That's fine. That's fine. Right.
So the point is really that in the transition period, because we're still. We've started the forecasting now to build up experience and to improve the forecasting methodology. But in those first 2 or 3 years, and it remains to be determined between ourselves and our colleagues in the Scottish Government if it's 2 or 3 years, but in that period, we don't want the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament to bear the risks of forecasting fluctuations, but clearly the amount received should be adjusted according to decisions about the income tax rate. So the Scottish Government would receive more if it increased the tax rate and receive less if it cut taxes.
Okay. Let's move on to forecasting, because we've taken evidence from the OBR, and we've got real concerns about their forecasting, which appears to be based more or less on extrapolating UK figures. Now, what they've basically said is, and I quote, very much view the forecast as work in progress for the time being. This is a learning experience for us and for everybody. But if you look at the huge differences in terms of forecasting, in March 2012, the OBR forecast £5,633 to be the figure for 2016-17. For 2016-17, they forecast the figure in December 2012 to be £5,242, which is, sorry, £5.242 billion, which is a fall in 13%. And if you actually look at the figure that they forecast in March 2013, again for 2016-17, it was 4.976 billion. Now that's a reduction in terms of the forecasting of some 17% from the original figure, or £657 million. Now, the reason I'm very concerned about that is because under the Scotland Act, the Scottish Parliament would only be able to borrow £200 million annually in terms of deviations, with a total of £500 million. Now, clearly, if we're getting forecasts that need such huge adjustment over a period of 1 year, that makes the Scottish Parliament extremely vulnerable to wrong or erroneous forecasting. So, how do we ensure that the Scottish Parliament, or indeed, if you want to look at it from the other perspective, the UK government, do not actually end up losing significant sums of money due to errors in forecasting?
I'll just make three brief points in response to that. Firstly, of course, it's precisely for this reason that we've started the process of the OBR has started the process of forecasting now, so that they can improve their forecast methodology. Secondly, there's a group of people working to oversee that process. The Scottish Government is fully involved in all of the discussions about the forecast methodology, working with the OBR to enhance and improve their forecasting. So there's no sense in which this is a process that's being divorced from the views or impacts that it would potentially have. But I think the most important point is that the block grant adjustment methodology that we've chosen, the Holtham method, which has been agreed between ourselves, and I think, as I understand it, been welcomed by this committee, means that the Scottish Parliament would only suffer a loss or indeed a gain if the change in forecast is different to the change in forecast for the rest of the UK. So I haven't actually got the UK figures that are equivalent to this, but I think I'm right in saying that the decline in the forecast that you referred to, I think it was £650 million nearly over 2 forecast rounds, simply reflects a decline in the forecast for the UK as a whole. So in that case, there's no differential impact on Scotland, and therefore there wouldn't be, in this case, an actual loss to the Scottish Parliament. It's only where the forecast, or indeed the outturn, is different in Scotland to the rest of the UK. So that could be, there could be a number of reasons for it. It could be a consequence of policy choices on either side, for example. So the £650 million here would not be a cash loss to the Scottish Parliament at the time that the reconciliation takes place at the end of the year, when the new system is up and running. Because that reconciliation looks at both the forecast for Scotland and the forecast for the UK as a whole. And it's only where there's a differential impact that there's a financial gain or loss to the Scottish Parliament. So actually in this case, where you saw the £650 million change, I haven't examined the figures in minute detail, but I think in this case you would actually find that it wouldn't cost the Scottish Parliament anything in the reconciliation, because you'd also seen a deterioration in the forecast for the whole of the UK.
Not in SRIT, but if you look at landfill tax, then it's a different kind of ballgame, and I think there's a real issue there that the OBR hasn't taken into account, and we've raised this matter with them directly. Scottish policy, for example, to go towards a zero waste strategy, which would reduce income and landfill tax quite significantly. So we still have considerable concerns on that particular issue, and I'm sure colleagues will want to pick up on that as we go forward.
I mean, I'd be keen to talk about that, because we've agreed the block grant adjustment methodology for the Scottish rate of income tax, And what we're talking about here is about how that process works in practice and how we make sure that the principles that both parliaments have set out, which is that the process of devolving tax powers should be equitable. It shouldn't be a kind of windfall gain or loss to either Scottish or UK taxpayers, but that where policy or other factors result in an improvement in Scotland, that Scotland should take the gain from that. We haven't concluded the discussions about precisely how the block grant should be adjusted for the minor taxes, so for stamp duty, land tax and for landfill tax. We're still discussing that with the Scottish Government. What we're aiming for is something which meets that principle of equity, which meets the commitment we made in the command paper to be a one-off adjustment, and which is sort of simple to implement, because there's small amounts of money involved, so we don't necessarily want to have the degree of complexity that we have around the Scottish rate of income tax, and that complexity is necessary for income tax because it's a large sum of money.
When do you hope to have these discussions concluded?
Well, I've just had just before this meeting, John Swinney and I had a discussion about it, and there are a range of different options for how to work this through. We've asked our officials on both sides to go away and work together to illustrate in more detail some of the different options, we would hope to resolve that in the next few months. Clearly, it needs to be resolved in the next few months because time is marching on.
Indeed. Okay, I just want to ask you one more question before I let colleagues in, and it's on the block grant adjustment mechanism. The adjustment mechanism provides incentives for the Scottish Government to grow the income tax base, but there are concerns really about how there should be how we look at comparable adjustment. Our previous budget advisor, Professor David Bell, said that indexation should be based on comparable adjustment to the UK income tax base, but he's not clear what comparable means. For example, it could be indexed against the growth in comparable income tax receipts in the rest of the UK, but another interpretation is it could be indexed against the growth in the level of income subject to income tax in the rest of the UK. So I'm just wondering if you could provide any clarification for us on that.
The answer is it's the latter. It's the growth in income that is liable for income tax. And clearly, we seek to collect all of that, but we don't always completely succeed. But that's the proper definition of what the tax base is. It's exactly right. Scotland gains or loses depending really on whether Scotland's able to grow its tax base compared to the rest of the UK or shrink its tax base. And clearly, recent history shows, the last 20 years or so, very good, employment performance in Scotland, slightly better than the rest of the UK, very slightly better GDP growth performance than the rest of the UK. So I think there are reasons to be encouraged on that front. And clearly, the whole purpose of devolution is our shared belief that by passing over these levers, you also create some additional levers to help grow the economy.
Thank you for that. The first person to ask questions from this committee will be Michael, to be followed by Jamie.
Thanks, Convener. Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. As to follow on the point that the Convener made around the landfill tax and the adjustment, as the Convener rightly said, there is no specific figure for landfill tax revenues available from HMRC. Now, the Convener explained that we've had some concerns about the accuracy of the OBR, but even setting that aside as a principle, if we accept that the OBR were right, do you not consider there to be real concerns about the principles in using figures which are an assumption of a constant share of UK figures rather than looking at the specific level of the revenue obtained by the Scottish Government via the landfill tax? I mean, there must be inherent dangers in not having a specific figure rather than just using an extrapolation of UK figures.
I think it's a very important question. And it's part of the reason why we're still working on what should be the block grant adjustment methodology for the smaller taxes. I mean, if you look at the two that we're talking about at the moment, in the case of landfill tax, it looks like the tax base is gradually declining, UK-wide. But if you look at stamp duty land tax, while there's quite a lot of volatility, historically that is a tax base that's been growing and is forecast to grow. We'll need to have an adjustment methodology that is able to take account of both of those facts in a way that is fair to both the UK and the Scottish taxpayer. Because what you don't want to have is a block grant adjustment methodology that either leaves a windfall gain or a windfall loss to Scotland or to the rest of the UK, but rather creates opportunities for the Scottish Parliament, which it can build that tax base and therefore grow its revenues if that's what you and your colleagues decide to do. So, for example, I have real problems with the idea if a one-off adjustment was to be purely in cash terms, then clearly the value of that would erode over time with inflation, and therefore would cause a windfall gain to the Scottish government and a windfall loss to the UK taxpayers over quite a number of years. And so you have to move on in terms of looking at what an appropriate methodology would be beyond a simple cash figure that depreciates over time. To look at other options, but precisely to take account of the facts that you said. I guess there's then a choice which relates to your question about, do you take landfill tax and stamp duty land tax together and just have one adjustment for the two taxes lumped together? It would be possible to have adjustments differentiated between the two taxes. It's probably simpler to take the two together because the growth and shrinkage of the tax bases for each tax would offset one another.
The Cabinet Secretary here has predicted that the reduction in landfill tax revenues would drop from about 107 million in 2015-16 down to 40 million in 2025. And that's a fairly significant change. We hear regularly on this committee that those involved in business, regardless of what area, when it comes to taxation, don't like shocks. So to have a significant drop of around £60 million and for that not to be adjusted accurately could create one of those shocks which would not be considered particularly favourably by the business community in particular who are operating in those areas. So these things have to be ironed out well in advance so that we don't have the disparities that create problems for those who are operating within the regulations of those industries. So, while I understand the principles that you're saying about trying to, equalise things out, if the change in the landfill tax is significantly greater than the change in the land and building taxation, that would create a problem. And since we foresee that, should it not be possible for us to address it?
Well, I would say it's a fair point. I would say two things. Firstly, the sorts of forecasts that you see for Scotland and for the rest of the UK are broadly similar. I don't think there's a particular divergence in forecast landfill tax revenues between Scotland and the rest of the UK. And so you'd want an adjustment methodology that reflected the facts on both sides. So in other words, if landfill tax were not being devolved, those revenues would be declining UK-wide. And so you would still, and for good reasons, the whole point of the tax is to dissuade people from going to landfill. And one might say this is a success of an environmental policy, that the revenues are declining, albeit or forecast to decline. Though actually, the OBR's forecast of Scottish taxes in March 2013 actually forecast a broadly flat picture on landfill tax. But it's also interesting that on stamp duty land tax, which is a much larger revenue stream than landfill tax, at that stage they were forecasting going from 275 million in 11-12 on stamp duty land tax to 509 million in 17-18. So you're also seeing a growth in the stamp duty tax base, which is far outweighing any decline or flatness in the landfill tax base. And as such, I would say it's not a shock. It's something which can clearly be forecast and needs to be taken into account in the methodology that we choose.
Yeah, but I think the two separate taxes, as they've been brought forward, I think the evidence that we've heard would suggest that in terms of the land and building tax, or the equivalent of the stamp duty land tax, would remain reasonably constant. The difference is that in Scotland, the drive to a zero waste strategy appears to exceed the expectations of the rest of the UK, and therefore over time there will be a greater reduction in revenue in relation to the landfill tax, which would not be accounted for if we just assume across the UK and we build in the mechanism that you're suggesting, where we sort of look at the two together and extrapolate out from there. And I just think unless we look at the disparity, the divergence between the landfill tax here and in the rest of the UK, that we could be leading ourselves into a problem when it comes to the adjustments.
I would only say that the purpose of devolving taxes is to increase financial accountability and to put additional levers into the hands of the Scottish Parliament. And if a consequence of a policy choice made here, quite legitimately, is to erode a tax base more quickly for good, very, very good reasons, which I would incidentally support, but you know that's irrelevant to the point. Then that is a cost that quite properly should be borne by the Scottish Parliament, because the devolution of this tax is promoting greater accountability in that policy area. And so the block grant adjustment methodology needs to take into account the forecast, it needs to take into account the forecast UK-wide, but it shouldn't be saying, let's in the adjustment methodology pass the cost of a policy choice made here to the UK taxpayer through the adjustment methodology. That's not what we should be seeking to do.
Thanks, Gabriel.
Okay, Jamie, to be followed by Jean.
Thank you very much, Convener. There's a convention, I think there's an agreement that where expenditures incurred through a decision that's taken by the Westminster Parliament, the Westminster Government, they bear the cost. Where a decision is taken here, the Scottish Government will bear the cost. Do you think that's a sensible arrangement?
Yeah, I mean, it's well established in the Statement of Funding Policy, which is updated at every full spending review. Costs of devolution should be are borne by the Scottish Government. So, for example, but costs of decisions or requirements of the UK Government are borne by the UK Government. So I think it's quite proper that the Scottish the Scottish budget should bear the cost, for example, of getting the systems ready to apply a Scottish rate of income tax, for example.
Well, that's interesting that you say that, because that's exactly where I wanted to go. I mean, the Scottish rate of income tax comes from the provision set out in the Scotland Act, if I'm correct. Where is that? That's an act of Westminster, not an act of this Parliament. So the question is, why is it that the Scottish Government is expected to bear the burden of implementation costs?
All devolution is a consequence of choices made by political parties and politicians here in Scotland, but enacted through the Scotland Act as it's evolved over time. And that's exactly the principle that's been applied in other areas. It's set out also in the Statement of Funding Policy. It's the way in which costs were borne in earlier phases of devolution. I think it's appropriate that we should continue, because in the end, this Parliament has also passed a legislative consent motion to accept and welcome the tax powers that are being devolved. I hope I've interpreted that correctly. And it's a well-established convention that the Scottish Government would then bear the cost of implementing those things, because they are then responsibilities, devolved responsibilities for the Scottish Government.
So Westminster decides and the Scottish Government has to pick up the tab. So, you know, the UK Government is estimating the cost, though, so you're in control of what the costs are. and your estimate was some £40 to £45 million for implementation. To be fair, your officials in evidence to this committee previously said that they hoped the expenditure will be significantly less than £45 million. Can you update us in that regard?
I don't have any update on the costs to give the committee, though that's the sort of thing that in our annual reports we can keep people updated on. I'd say also that it's essential. This is essential that. And it's a fact that the Scottish Government has a seat on the programme board that is implementing the Scotland Act, so is involved in all of the key decisions, is able to challenge those decisions and indeed costs attached to them as appropriate. There is a memorandum of understanding between HMRC and the Scottish Government that sets out precisely how these things will work, how costs are apportioned. And that memorandum of understanding makes clear that HMRC will consult with the Scottish Government at each stage, and also gives them the option of third-party scrutiny if they would want to have that on costs, and obviously particularly on IT costs, because a lot of this is IT systems that need to be built to implement the Scottish rate of income tax. And so I think that on the costs, the systems are both very transparent to the Scottish Government, and also the Scottish Government has a seat at the table, it has a degree of power and ability to challenge, and all the things that you would expect. So this is definitely not the case that someone in London is deciding what the costs are and just sending a bill to Holyrood. It is a much more discursive and iterative process.
They are the UK government's estimate. It's not the Scottish Government that's come up with that. It's HMRC, isn't it?
But what I'm saying is at each stage, the Scottish Government is involved in the choices about how to go about this, and obviously those decisions determine what the costs are, but also has the ability to challenge at each and every stage, not just challenge itself, but also to bring in independent advice, if they wish to give further independent challenge to costs, precisely so that you don't have a perception that these costs have just been determined somewhere else and a bill's just been sent to Holyrood. That wouldn't be right. It needs to be a much more open and discursive process than that.
I wanted to explore something you said in terms of the block grant adjustment as it relates to LBTT and landfill tax. I think you clearly set out in previous evidence there your opposition to a one-off adjustment in cash terms. The mechanism might be the same, but then in cash terms it could be different on a year-on-year basis. I mean, would you not accept that most people would question whether that truly is a one-off adjustment? I mean, it's going to be different year on year then.
Well, let me give you an example which is well established, but not from taxation, but from other spheres of devolution. So, when a new responsibility is passed to the Scottish Government, I mean, it was a few years back, for example, responsibility for some areas of transport policy, where it was under the previous Westminster Government and I think under the previous Scottish Government. Then a one-off adjustment is made, the block grant is adjusted, and an adjustment is also made to the comparability factors in the Barnett formula, such that future changes reflect the policy change that's taking place. That is a one-off adjustment. The adjustment is made once. It happens at the time at which those spending responsibilities are devolved, and it ensures both that the amount of money that is passed over properly reflects the new responsibilities, but also that the mechanism for adjusting spending in future reflects the fact that that decision has been made. That is a one-off adjustment that takes place in the spending front. One option, one of many options, would be to construct a parallel methodology for the two sort of smaller taxes that you described. To my mind, that is plainly a one-off adjustment. The issue I was referring to in cash terms, though, I think it was quite well illustrated by Mr. McMahon's questions, is that where you've got a relatively buoyant and growing tax base, and you make a one-off adjustment in cash terms, which is then, the value of which is reduced year on year by inflation, then you have an increasing divergence between the two, which is not related to policy choices, to economic accountability, to the decisions of the Scottish Government, which you know, quite properly, those things should then be an opportunity to grow tax revenues, but it's simply a kind of windfall gain, if you like, on the basis of the adjustment methodology that's decided. And both governments and both parliaments have, I think, enthusiastically accepted the principle that the process by which this devolution of tax powers takes place is not one that should be to any detriment or gain as a feature of the process to either Scotland or to the UK. But you know, once the powers are devolved, it's then a matter for the Scottish Parliament how it exercises them, and if it wants to make choices to grow the tax base or to increase rates, and quite properly, Scotland should gain revenues from that, or if it wishes to cut taxes, Scotland should lose revenues.
And you know, I may be paraphrasing slightly. He said we're seeing a steeper growth in LBTT than we are in landfill tax. You cited the... Well, that's exactly the point, isn't it? Because you said we're seeing it, but we're not seeing it unless we've got a crystal ball, unless we're psychic. We're not seeing it. It is a forecast and they're subject to readjustment all the time. But if I heard you correctly, you said it would be important to include forecasts as part of any adjustment mechanism. But I mean, given that they're forecasts, surely it would make much more sense to look at the actual reality of the collection of taxes and perhaps use an average of a set figure of actual figures we know. Wouldn't that be much fairer, much clearer? Everyone knows where they stand, and using forecasts that could be, as we know, are totally subject to change.
The point I was making about stamp duty land tax is that there's been a, you know, if you go back over the last 5 years, let's say, actually you would be looking at a period of unprecedented economic challenge, where you know, revenues had been particularly depressed. If you go back over a longer period of time, then you would have more of a sense both of the fluctuations and of the heights that these revenues can reach and the depth to which they can fall. But you also get a sense, looking at this over time, and I don't think this is contested, of a tax base that is, when you look through the volatility, gradually increasing, and where with a growing population, with demographic change within household formation and so on, you see over time a greater transactions volume, and so you would need to reflect that. Precisely what the correct period to calculate that over is a matter for debate and discussion. But I do think that our methodology needs to take into account not just what has happened recently, but also what are the prospects for these taxes, because you know, this is the block grant adjustment methodology. It's a one-off thing. It's something that we would decide and then would be implemented, you know, would keep going for many years. I think Robert Choate made the same point to you actually about how SDLT revenues have been particularly depressed over the last period, and therefore taking just a 5-year historical figure.
As I just said, over a period.
Well, 5 years has a number that's been floated in the debate, and I think that, you know, that would be it's a particularly extraordinary period of time, and so it would not give a fair reflection of the prospects for revenues from stamp duty land tax, which was fair to both Scotland and to the United Kingdom.
I have one last quick question. Indeed, I appreciate that. It will be brief. I mean, I was interested to hear you suggest that, you know, the SDLT indicates, you know, gradual growth over a period of time. I mean, would you define from 11-12 to 17-18 growing from 275 million to 509 as is forecast as gradual growth?
No, that's pretty sharp growth actually, and it just reflects that. No, I didn't say that. I said that we are still discussing with the Scottish Government what is precisely the right way to make this adjustment. The point I'm making is that a one-off cash adjustment that depreciates over time is not a fair reflection of a tax base that historically has grown steadily over time, is forecast to grow over the next few years. But look, we're still discussing this with the Scottish Government. I'd be very interested to see what the committee's conclusions are and what you think the most the fairest methodology is. I think all I'd say is that it is it is essential to me, and I hope it will be essential to this committee too, that the choice of adjustment methodology is not one that, in and of itself, either advantages or disadvantages either the Scottish Parliament or the UK Parliament.
Dean, to be followed by John.
Morning. In the UK Government report, Strengthening Scotland's Future, which I think is a really good title, I mean, we would agree that more taxes devolved, more powers devolved will be strengthening Scotland's future. And independence, of course, is something that we'd strengthen it absolutely. So we approve of the title. But you talk about increasing financial accountability of the Scottish Parliament. Is that to the Scottish people or the UK Government?
Firstly, I don't accept the premise of the question, but it's not, the committee perhaps is not an appropriate time to debate this, that independence would strengthen Scotland's future. We'll all be debating that over the next 12 months, but just to put on the record that I rather strongly disagree with that particular assertion. The Scottish Parliament is accountable to the Scottish people, and financial accountability means that that the Scottish Parliament bears the financial consequences of its decisions. So, for example, if you to go back to Mr. McMahon's questions, if you choose a particular policy on waste that leads to absolutely zero landfill, and that leads to zero landfill tax revenues, well, that's a choice, and it's a choice that has financial as well as environmental and social consequences, and all of those things need to be taken into account together, and that's the whole purpose of it. But Scotland is part of the United Kingdom, and we have a well-established system of allocating a block grant. Part of the purpose of this is to shift the balance of financing from block grant to more self-financing, and that's appropriate. But we also need to make sure that the block grant part of it is handled in a way that continues to be fair to UK taxpayers as well as to Scottish taxpayers.
Given that the new Scotland-specific taxes are subject to agreement with the UK Government, though, does the Scottish Parliament really have the freedom to exercise new fiscal powers on the scale that the UK Government's articulating in this document? I mean, it's very clear that it wants to, showing that the Scottish Government is in control, but really it's the UK Government in control.
Well, we haven't yet had any proposals from the Scottish Government for new taxes to be created. I look forward to hearing them. And I would say that the Act gives a great deal of freedom, and that with the approval of the Treasury provision is not intended to inhibit the Scottish Parliament coming up with proposals or implementing those proposals. But let me give you an example. There are some quite strict European Union rules, for example, about not taxing the same tax base twice. It's the UK government that is the member state of the European Union. So we would just need to assure ourselves, for example, that any proposal didn't, for example, break European law, because in the end, the UK government would be the party that was pursued through the courts or whatever the appropriate action would be at a European level. But there is no intention behind this at all to prevent the Scottish Government coming up with new taxes and implementing them. The whole point of it is to say that if there are new tax bases, then the Scottish Government is free to put forward ideas for taxes, to then implement those taxes, and of course to be accountable to the Scottish people for those choices.
What would constitute clear evidence that arrangements for forecasting Scottish income tax receipts and the new tax collection were, and just a quote from the document, operating effectively?
Well, do you mean in relation to the Scottish rate of income tax? Well, I think that, in a sense, the evidence will be clear. It will be that the tax is being collected effectively, that the money is being passed over effectively, that HMRC is delivering its side of the bargain according to the Memorandum of Understanding and the policies that are agreed. That will be reported on regularly to both parliaments, and so there'll be plenty of opportunities for both the Scottish Parliament and the UK Parliament to look at the evidence of progress, and indeed, once the taxes are implemented, to see the information for itself. In addition, the Act makes clear that the National Audit Office will have a clear role here, as it does in public expenditure, for examining, according to the test that it applies, expenditure. And you know, obviously, the Scottish Parliament will be keen to see the National Audit Office carry out those functions properly. They've been clear with us that they need a particular legislative base. They want a particular legislative base for those reports. That will be put in place. And I hope that that will, in terms of the evidence, that the National Audit Office work will give a proper degree of assurance in relation to the evidence to this committee and to the Parliament.
And
Last question, Jean.
Last question, just briefly, big question. So, in the debate that's going on, and although you don't want to talk about independence,
but I'm not sure it's the purpose. No, I'm not sure it's the purpose of the committee of this particular hearing.
The Scotland Act.
I'm happy to trespass on other territory, Mr. Chairman, if you would like me to.
But there is a regularly declaration that should Scotland not vote yes at the Scotland Act would be strengthened, that you have would be offering the Scottish people further fiscal autonomy and tax-raising powers. What would that look like? Or when will you declare that?
That's not what we're here to discuss, unfortunately. Although I'm sure we would like to, and we're short of time, so we need to move on. John, to be followed by Gavin.
Thanks, Convener. Just following on from some of the points that have been made maybe already, when you answered Jean Urquhart just now, you said that European legislation wouldn't allow us to tax the same base twice. Is that not what Scottish rate of income tax does?
No, because we are... the collection is all taking place through HMRC, as is agreed. We are reducing the rate at UK level, and creating the Scottish rate of income tax. That is all legislated through the UK Parliament. So it's a well-established mechanism. Other countries have different rates of income tax at different levels of government. But for example, if this, it's a different thing to. I'm trying to think of an example, but if the Scottish government was to put forward a new tax that sought to raise money from an area that's already taxed at a UK level, then that is something which potentially, but each case would have to be examined, would be in breach of EU requirements.
Okay, that's maybe something that other people can look at in more detail. I mean, under Chapter 1, I think it is of it's the report that our first annual report, and I think it's signed off by Michael Moore. Is that correct? And it talks about devolving further existing taxes and creating new devolved taxes. So that's the kind of area we're in just now. I mean, one example that has been floated would be air passenger duty. I mean, at what time would the UK government be open to discussing devolving air passenger duty?
Well, we decided as we were implementing the Scotland Act that given the uncertainty over the potential impact of devolving APD on the UK as a whole, we took the decision not to devolve APD in the Scotland Act 2012. And we're now focusing our efforts on implementing, and it's the main subject of the session, on implementing the powers that have been legislated for. That is a, as the hearing has already illustrated, a complex and serious set of challenges. We haven't put a timescale on that, but we would at all. And clearly, without wishing to go over the subject that you quite rightly ruled out of order earlier in this section, Mr. Chairman, there's to be a referendum on Scotland's constitutional status, and clearly, that's an issue that needs to be dealt with one way or another before further decisions could be taken.
Yes, but I suppose with all due respect, we are looking at this Act, and this Act does talk about other devolution. So if we forget about the referendum for a minute, if that's allowed.
It would be very welcome.
Well, I think for the purpose of this committee, we'll forget about it. I mean, all of this is not going to be in until about maybe, what, 2020, if we go through the process, when we look at income tax and how that's going to work its way through. So, I mean, would you actually say that we would not look at any other taxes or even, say, more control over income tax until at least 2020?
Not necessarily. I'd say, though, that it's not included in this Act, and so any such decision would require a political consensus around it. It would require to be legislated for, and then it would require its own implementation timetable. But actually, in terms of the implementation timetable for the Scotland Act, when you're looking at devolved taxes coming into force in 2015-16, so it's only a couple of years away. And obviously, with the Scottish rate of income tax, there is a significant transitional period. I think that is a sensible precaution to protect in the early years the Scottish government from undue volatility. But you know, I certainly would not present this as something which isn't happening until 2020. Quite the reverse. This is something which is coming at us pretty quickly down the track.
Okay. In one of your answers to the convener, you talked about there would only be a loss to Scotland. This isn't the Scottish rate of income tax. If I understood this correctly, if there was a differential change in the forecast between the UK and Scotland. So it's just to kind of clarify that in my own mind a little bit. So are we saying then that if, say, the forecast was over-optimistic for both the UK and Scotland, and to the same extent, the income tax receipts were then less than expected, there would be no particular loss to Scotland because, I mean, even under the old system with the block grant would have been cut because the UK had less income. Is that roughly what we're meaning?
So the block grant is a consequence of spending decisions, which are then to which the Barnett formula is applied. Generally speaking, the UK does not adjust its spending in year according to tax revenue, tax receipts. We use our borrowing powers and so on to smooth that over time. So in general terms, you would not see under the current arrangements today, you would not see an adjustment to the block grant in year or even in a subsequent year because of a weakness in one particular type of receipts. At the moment, we're going through a substantial fiscal adjustment, which is based on a very large gap emerging under the previous Westminster government between what we raise and what we spend, which has to be filled as a consequence of the financial crisis. But what I'm saying is that the methodology we have in mind is one that means that in the circumstances you describe, where the forecast for Scotland and the rest of the UK turns out to be equally over-optimistic, that there would be no additional, through the block grant adjustment methodology, there would be no cost to Scotland under those circumstances. Equally, if the forecast for Scotland and for the UK had both been equally pessimistic, and there were extra receipts, but there was no differential between them, then the same would apply in the opposite direction.
At the moment, I mean,
it's one of the beauties of the Halford methodology, actually, yes. is that it means that you don't see those sorts of unfair divergences.
Right, well, if I can just press you on that a little bit more, because at the moment, I mean, as you've correctly said, I think the block grant doesn't immediately respond to changes in the income tax receipts or other tax receipts at the UK level. Will the block grant adjustment not respond more quickly to these receipts?
It would if there was a differential between the receipts against forecast in Scotland as against receipts against forecast in the rest of the UK. The basic idea is that when you're seeing fluctuations in the tax base or in tax receipts UK-wide, that there should not be a particular additional cost to Scotland of that, but clearly if Scotland has taken steps to grow its own tax base, or indeed as a consequence has shrunken its tax base, then the tax hit of that should be something which, or gain indeed, should be something that does apply to Scotland. But where the entire UK economy is facing difficulties, it would be wrong to particularly penalise Scotland through a block grant adjustment methodology for those circumstances.
Because the whole place would be penalised, effectively. Yes.
Exactly. And of course, it may well be the case that if that's a problem that went on for a period of years, that the UK government would need to make fiscal adjustments. Those fiscal adjustments would be reflected through the block grant overall, exactly as is happening at the moment. But the methodology for adjusting the block grant as part of the Scottish rate of income tax would not cause that effect in Scotland. I think it's a very important point actually to understand about the methodology that we've collectively chosen, because it does offer real protection against those sorts of problems, which I think wouldn't have been necessarily there under the previous proposed methodology.
And my final point, just to touch again on what Mr Hepburn was saying about the implementation costs. I mean, I kind of follow the logic that if Scotland introduces a new land and buildings transaction tax, the cost of that should be ours. I find it slightly harder to understand the logic that switching off the previous UK stamp duty land tax should also be our cost. I mean, I had thought that under the Scotland Act, thinking that if costs were incurred by decisions that we made here, that would be, we would write the cheque. But if costs were incurred by decisions made at Westminster, they would pay the cheque. But that doesn't seem to be what's working out in practice.
I think it is, and I mean, I would say that the decisions that have been taken about apportionment of costs follow exactly the methodology under previous sets of decisions. They follow the policy set out in the statement of a funding policy. And I think there's a good deal of protection for the Scottish Government in terms of its involvement in all of those decisions and its ability to scrutinise those costs. But fundamentally, responsibility is, in the case of income tax, for example, is being handed to the Scottish Parliament. There are additional costs in order to make that adjustment in terms of the tax collection systems at HMRC, the ability to differentiate between revenues from Scotland and revenues from the rest of the UK, the IT that's necessary to do that. I think it's appropriate that those costs are borne by the Scottish Government. Equally, you know, if we were to then insist on it being done in a particular way, maybe because we wanted some further adjustment made on top of what is agreed to be necessary, then there'll be a legitimate question about the costs. I would accept that. But you know, the basic construction of the Scottish rate of income tax is exactly like the evolution in other areas. I think it is appropriate that those costs are borne by the Scottish Government. That is another part of financial accountability, if you like.
And even switching off UK taxes?
In order to enable a Scottish tax to take place, yes.
Okay. Gavin, to be followed by Malcolm.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions on the block grant adjustment mechanism for the landfill tax and the land and buildings transaction tax. I just wonder, is there an argument for having a different methodology for each of those taxes, given that one tax base is shrinking and one is growing? But further to that, the sort of policy objective behind the two taxes, I think, is different too. Both the UK government and the Scottish government want to see more activity in the housing market and in commercial property. Both the UK government and the Scottish government want to see less going to landfill. So I just wonder, is there a possibility of having a different methodology for each tax?
I mean, so far that's not one of the things that's been discussed between ourselves and the Scottish Government. I'd be open to considering such ideas if they were put forward. I think that on the one hand, there's your point, which is that the forecast growth in revenues for those taxes is quite different. They're on different trajectories. They have different objectives. On the other hand, there are, you know, particularly on landfill tax, there are relatively small sums of money at play, and you don't necessarily want an adjustment methodology that's overly complicated. And so I think you'd have to balance those two things up. Thus far, we've been considering taking a similar, an approach that looks at the two together. But I'd be very happy to consider ideas there. As I say, we still haven't reached agreement with the Scottish Government on what the best way to handle this problem is, because we need, on the one hand, to make sure we have it's a one-off adjustment. On the other hand, that it's an adjustment that remains equitable over time between Scottish and UK taxpayers. And it may be that what you're suggesting could be a way through that.
Specifically on the landfill tax, the most recent OBR projections between 11-12 and 13-14, it goes from 98 million to 95 million. So I would guess the first 2 years would probably be outturn as opposed to projection, or at least the first year. But then from 13-14, it goes from 95 to 108. So for the first 3 years, that to me, that feels right. That's what I would sort of anticipate, given the shrinking in the tax base that we've talked about. To go from 95 to 108, though, over a 5-year period, to me, just instinctively doesn't feel right. And I just wonder if you have a view on that, and if that's something that can be looked at in more depth, just to make sure that is an accurate, it's a forecast, of course, but is as accurate as possible a forecast, taking in all the likely political factors.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it's an OBR forecast. I wouldn't wish to question the forecasting methodology of the OBR. I'm not sure it would be appropriate for me to do so, but it's a very good question for you to ask them, because, and indeed, it's a very good question for the Scottish Government, who are part of the discussions about the forecasting methodology to look at, because clearly you're right. You want to make sure that the forecasting methodology is based on an accurate representation of the factors at play as possible. I mean, this may be related to the growth forecasts and perhaps the thought that there might be more landfill activity taking place as the economy grows. I don't know, but I'm afraid I don't know what lies behind this. But I think it is a good sort of test to look at these forecasts and say, well, do they feel right? And if they don't, well, let's go back and look at the methodology again.
And then just a question about the land and buildings transaction tax block grant adjustment mechanism. There seem to me to be sort of two options presented so far. One was the sort of initial UK government position of looking at forecasts, which has the I suppose the downside to that is that there's a danger of volatility, and there's a danger, I think, obviously, on certainly the initial OBR forecasts were very different from ones 12 months later. The Scottish Government position was one of retrospective, which has I suppose, the benefit of certainty, but given that the Cabinet Secretary put forward the 5-year proposal, I think the point you made earlier that would basically pick the sort of 5 of probably the lowest years of economic growth over decades.
Position
It is, but I mean,
and so on, but
so clearly there are sort of disadvantages with either. Is there a sort of magic Holtham Mark II type way of doing it that actually will satisfy all of the criteria that everyone has laid down about how we do it, or are negotiations at pretty early stages on how we actually, resolve this one?
I don't think there's a Holtham Mark II on this, because I mean, in the sense that we've been looking for something which is simpler than the Holtham methodology for the smaller taxis, I think for good administrative reasons. It's not necessarily my view, by the way, that this should be based on forecasts. That's just one option. You might look back over a much longer period of time. That would be another option, so that you get a sense of where those revenues have been going historically, and roll that forward. You're right that there is quite a lot of volatility here. Of course, it's not the purpose of the block grant adjustment mechanism to take account of volatility. There are other mechanisms in the Scotland Act, the Scottish Cash Reserve and the current borrowing powers, which are there precisely to give the Scottish Government tools to manage receipt volatility. Receipt volatility is a problem that's facing any government that is collecting taxes, and it's part of the, managing that volatility is part of the responsibility that's being taken on and being devolved. And I hope that with the cash reserve and the borrowing powers, the tools there are necessary. What I'm more concerned about is to make sure that, however the block grant adjustment, whatever methodology is determined eventually for the block grant adjustment for stamp duty, that it reflects the fact that this is a tax base that has been growing over time, and therefore that the amount that the block grant is adjusted by does not gradually build up a loss to UK taxpayers, where the UK taxpayer is paying more block grant than it should be, because, for example, in a cash terms adjustment, that erodes over time, whereas you're seeing the tax base grow over time. That wouldn't be fair to UK taxpayers. Beyond that, I'm quite happy to look at any number of options to work out what is fair and simple, and is one-off and is but fundamentally is done on the basis of no detriment to either UK or Scottish taxpayers.
Thank you.
I would also like to ask about the block grant adjustment, because I think that is the key issue politically as well as financially for these devolved taxes and for future fiscal devolution. So just briefly, because obviously the landfill and the land building transaction tax have been dealt with in detail, but I did notice that you didn't understandably want to criticise the OBR, but equally earlier on you'd been talking quite openly about the shrinkage of the landfill, which is the opposite of what the OBR are saying in their forecast. And on the other one, although I take your point about the last 5 years having been extraordinary, you could equally say that the 5 subsequent years are going to be unusual and extraordinary because they're compensating for what's gone before. So I suppose part of my conclusion from that is accepting the principle that neither government should benefit, that the idea of looking at trends over a longer period of time might in fact be more politically acceptable as well as more financially accurate, possibly.
I think there's a lot of merit in that. Looking at long-term trends is a way to look through the kind of short-term fluctuations, and I think that would make some sense. It may be an area where we want to have periodic reviews that enable these things to be updated. But I think your basic point, which is that you don't want to have any particular short period, each of which has short-term volatility, to determine what happens in perpetuity in future.
I mean, I think the income tax one is far more significant, not just in financial terms, because obviously, but also because the indexation may be significant for further fiscal devolution. So, I mean, Professor Holtom has been quoted more than once this morning, but I did notice a quote that I've got here from him where he says, "It is not in the devolved territory's interest if its own tax base is inevitably slower growing than that of the UK." So in a kind of way, I am attracted to what's proposed, but on the basis that government's action can influence the tax base. But are there in fact circumstances where one country's, presumably the rest of the UK tax base inevitably grows faster or inevitably goes slower? But I suppose the thing that people in Scotland might be worried about, are there inevitable things that are out with government control, which means that the tax base in the rest of the UK might grow more quickly than in Scotland?
I don't think there are inevitable factors that lead that to be inevitable. I mean, you will have seen that yesterday, as part of our Scotland analysis programme, we published quite a lot of data about macroeconomic and fiscal performance of Scotland and the rest of the UK in the last few decades. And I think that what that information shows is that on the things that might determine the growth of the income tax base, GDP growth, where Scotland's performance has marginally exceeded that of the rest of the UK for the past 20 years. Employment, where there is a, again, if you look at the 60s and 70s, Scotland fell behind the rest of the UK, or 70s and 80s rather, 90s and 2000s, Scotland's marginally exceeded the rest of the UK. So I would hope that that recent data would give a degree of reassurance on that point.
In terms of the forecast being wrong for income tax, I take your point that Scotland wouldn't be disadvantaged more than the rest of the UK, but I suppose if the forecasts are significantly out, the UK government has massive borrowing powers to cover that, whereas if the forecasts are out for Scotland, Scotland has very limited revenue borrowing powers. So could there be an issue there if the forecasts were significantly wrong, as it were?
I suppose in theory there could be, but I think in practice you'd only be looking at situations where the forecast was both significantly wrong and significantly wrong for Scotland in a way that differed markedly from the rest of the UK. In other words, it seems to me most likely that when the forecast goes wrong, it's as a consequence of macroeconomic conditions changing that affect the whole of the UK. And so you would not be likely to see sort of differential wrongness, as it were, emerge as a consequence of the way the forecasts are conducted. And therefore, I would say that a combination of the Scottish Cash Reserve and the current borrowing powers that are legislated for is more than sufficient to meet sort of differential fluctuations from the forecast that might apply to Scotland. But clearly, that's something that, you know, as the system beds in, and you know, over the years and decades to come, we need to kind of keep a close eye on.
Last question is about borrowing. I mean, clearly there has been some progress there in the Scotland Act, although no doubt there'll be discussions subsequently about whether those borrowing powers are adequate. But I suppose one question that's quite interesting in this regard is it's very tightly controlled in terms of capital borrowing, and the Scottish Government saying basically they would probably be able to borrow around £240 million annually, whereas local government, I don't know what the macro figure is, but clearly they've had considerable freedom in terms of prudential borrowing for a decade or so, and that's constrained by their ability to service that borrowing. So there does seem to be some discrepancy there. I mean, does the Treasury obviously is taking a hard line on Scottish Government borrowing, but in fact, is there not an inconsistency there? And in terms of the future, would it not be safe to give the Scottish Government greater borrowing powers on the basis that they're inevitably restrained by their ability to repay what they borrow?
Firstly, I wouldn't say this is a particularly hard line. I'd say this is the first time there's been legislation that has enabled Scotland to have borrowing powers. This is the Scotland Act, I think, is a hugely significant piece of further devolution. It's the first time that tax powers of this order have been devolved within the United Kingdom. We set out in the spending round, actually, the fact that in 15-16 the capital borrowing powers will be 296 million. So it's a figure that's derived from capital spending. So clearly, as capital spending increases over time, then the amount that can be borrowed will also increase in step with that. That should be some reassurance. And you know, over a 10-year period, there's a limit. But I mean, at the moment, that would be what, 2.2 billion. That of course also can rise over time. That's sufficient to carry out some major projects. Personally, I'd like to see the money used to accelerate the dualling of the A9, but I'm sure different people from different parts of Scotland would have different views on that. I think we should put in place these powers, see how they work, and then those, of course, can be looked at as part of a discussion, assuming we're in a constitutional position to have that discussion about what the next phase of devolution is.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask a further question on borrowing and then segue into the next section. Yes, I mean, I accept some of what you're saying, but one of the issues that concerns me is the fact that local authorities are actually able to borrow, for example, from the Public Works Loan Board, whereas the Scottish Government has to borrow from the National Loans Fund. And from the 1st of November this year, local authorities in England will be able to access borrowing below the Public Works Loan Board standard rate for approved projects at about 40 basis points below. That's 0.4%. So Scottish local authorities won't be able to access the same favourable borrowing, and neither will the Scottish Government. So why is that?
Well, I'd have to just double check the rates on the Public Works Loan Board and National Loans Fund. I think they're the same, but the Public Works Loan Board was established by statute to facilitate borrowing by local authorities. It's a subset of the National Loans Fund, so in that sense, I don't think that there should be great store held by the institutional difference. The Public Works Loan Board rate was actually increased by this government in the 2010 spending round. What was subsequently done is put in place a lower rate specifically for certain sorts of projects. It's known as the project rate. That is a sort of limited pot to encourage local authorities to take forward particular major infrastructure projects. It hasn't actually been, I mean, John Swinney has not raised the issue with me about whether Scottish local authorities should be able to benefit from that. I'd be happy to talk to him about it if he did.
Well, do you think they should, given you're a Scottish MP, apart from anything else?
I'd be happy to look at it. I think I'd have to look at that in the context of the overall borrowing environment in Scotland, but it seems to me to be a perfectly reasonable point that I'd happily take away from this committee.
Good, because I mean the point I'm making is that I don't think Scotland should be disadvantaged in terms of borrowing at the Scottish Parliament or local authority level.
Scottish Parliament will not be disadvantaged. In fact, of course, I would say that the rates available reflect the historically low gilt rates that the UK is able to command as a consequence of the fiscal credibility that we've built up and retained under this government, and it's considerably lower than many other countries are able to command in the markets. I venture to suggest that it's considerably lower than if the Scottish Government were to try and borrow commercially, it would be able to command. So I think there is I think it's, whilst I understand the point, I'd also say that the proposals are relatively advantageous to Scotland.
Okay, we won't go into loss of AAA, etc. then. Just to move on to budget announcement, and colleagues could actually tell me if they want to ask any questions. Jamie, you're the first. Just to ask, in terms of the budget announcement, why was the decision taken in March to take away £107 million of resource about 10 days before the start of the financial year? And was the Scottish Government actually consulted in terms of that before the decision was made?
Those decisions were, as it were, Barnett consequentials of wider decisions made on public expenditure. What was basically going on there was a shift at a UK level in the balance between current and capital spending. So I think from memory, maybe Paul can remind me, I'm right in saying that there was a small loss of resource that you've described, but also a much greater gain in capital spending. Our government and I have sought over the time we've been in office, wherever we can, to switch funding from current to capital spending. By and large, that's been a switch that has been encouraged by Scottish ministers. So, and the net effect overall on the Scottish Government's budget was positive. So,
I put that surely. I mean, I think that to replace an actual resource in hard cash with a loan. I mean, if I was to say to you, I'm going to replace your salary with a loan, I don't think you'd be very happy about it because you've got to repay it back. So how can you possibly say that it was advantageous when the money's got to be paid back, but the resource has been lost permanently?
Well, it's advantageous in two senses. Firstly, that if you take the Barnett consequentials of those decisions in the round, the gain on the capital side was greater than the loss on the resource side, quite substantially so. Part of that gain was, I think as you're implying, through so-called financial transactions. Those financial transactions are those are a serious tool in the economic armoury of a government. I don't think that they should be seen. The way in which they can be used is different, but actually I don't see it as a sort of second class to traditional capital spending. Far from it. I think it is something which enables the Scottish Government, if it wishes to intervene to support the housing market, for example, precisely the way that the financial transactions at a UK level are being used to support the Help to Buy equity loan scheme. And it's interesting that on Budget Day, for example, the Chief Executive of Homes for Scotland welcomed this move and urged the Scottish Government to follow it. So, and I hope very much that the Scottish Government will choose to follow it and use the positive consequentials to the good of the Scottish economy, because that's what they're there for.
But you're still losing hard cash and you're to be replaced by loans which have to be repaid. So clearly that's not advantageous, surely, because even the loans have to be repaid from the resource. You're cutting the resource initially, and then you're having to cut the resource a second time to pay back the loans that you've so generously given us.
The financial transactions are designed to be repaid by the recipients of the financial transactions. Certainly in the case of the Help to Buy equity loan scheme that the UK government has constructed, we fully expect that to happen. That's part of our, that's part of the accounting for that scheme. But I would also say that if what you want, as I do, and I'm sure this committee does too, is to support economic growth, then a shared equity scheme to enable construction activity to take place and to increase the volume of purchases of new build homes is a good thing from the economy, from which the whole of Scotland will benefit, not just now but in the future. So I'm afraid I don't see it in the way that you're describing.
Indeed. So was the UK government wrong then in cutting their capital budget by 26% over 3 years?
Well, I would say that if you look at what we did in the spending round in 2010 and subsequently, we have at every stage sought to shift money from current to capital. We were faced with public expenditure plans when we came in that took actually a greater reduction in capital than that which was set out in the 2010 spending round. But equally, we are also faced with one of the most challenging fiscal positions anywhere in the world. We have to take difficult decisions. That's why actually at each fiscal event since the 2010 spending round, we have switched money from current to capital. We've the Scottish Government over that period has benefited from those adjustments to the tune of, I think, £1.7 billion of additional capital spending that is available over and above the 2010 spending round. We have maintained those increments in the spending round for 2015-16 that we announced in June. And looking at a UK level, actually over the 10 years for which we've now set out capital spending plans, capital spending as a share of our national income is actually greater than over the period of the previous Westminster government. So I think that, look, I'm the first to acknowledge that this country faces a very challenging fiscal position and that we've had to make some very difficult spending decisions as a result. But I think that the economic priority that we've attached, wherever we can, to switching money to capital spending is right for the long-term future of the economy, and that includes financial transactions to support the housing market.
Thank you. Okay, brief questions, folks. Jamie, to be followed by Gavin.
Thank you. I want to look at the area of welfare reform and the impact that's having on Scottish budgets. We're seeing welfare reform's impact on people here in Scotland, my constituents, Mr Alexander's constituents, people across the country, and of course the Scottish Government has introduced the Scottish Welfare Fund. It's had to supplement that with £9 million of its own funding. It's had to plug a £40 million cut to council tax benefit around the cost of implementing the Scottish rate of income tax, a note in passing. Will this effort in mitigation, the money that the Scottish Government is having to channel in, as a consequence of decisions by the UK Government, will that be considered by the UK Government in future budgets and future spending reviews?
Those are choices for the Scottish Government. The Scottish Government has a block grant, which is, it comes under the Barnett formula, which is, as it were, automatically calculated as a consequence of UK spending plans. So the Barnett formula is not adjusted as a consequence of spending decisions taken by the Scottish Government. Likewise, some local authorities have set aside money from their own budgets for the same purpose. The UK Government also announced at the end of July that we were making additional funding available in Scotland and in other parts of the UK for discretionary housing payments, precisely because we wanted to make sure that local authorities had the resources available to manage the impact of some of the welfare changes.
Where the UK Government chooses not to support vulnerable people, the Scottish Government will have to just pick up the slack.
Well, what we're seeking to do is to ensure that the welfare budget, which is a very significant part of public expenditure in the UK, where we have to make adjustments across all areas of public spending, is focused in a way that is fair, that supports vulnerable people, and is fair to the taxpayer more generally. And our reforms are aimed at getting more people off benefit and into work. I was encouraged by the recent figures showing a decline in the number of economically inactive households as more people move off benefit and into work. That's a positive thing, but we also have to make sure that those changes are implemented sensitively, something I think is very important, and that's why we made additional resources available for discretionary housing payments in July.
Thank you. The financial transactions point came up obviously at the time of the spending round, and it has been touched on earlier today. Am I correct in thinking that there were previous financial transactions in 11-12 and 12-13 that didn't merit or didn't get the same amount of criticism as these most recent ones have?
You are exactly right. In fact, financial transactions have been part of the spending landscape for some, for very many years. And Scotland, the Scottish Government, since devolution, has enjoyed the Barnett consequentials of those financial transactions in each and every year. And I mean, look, to be honest, I found the reaction somewhat surprising and a wee bit bogus, because financial transactions are a way to support the economy. It's an additional tool for the Scottish Government, and one which the house building sector in particular has strongly encouraged the Scottish Government to use.
Have you had an explanation from the Scottish Government why they seem to accept them previously but are now strongly against them?
No, I haven't. The sense I get is the Scottish Government is now, as it should, working to find the best way to use this money. That's the proper response. I certainly haven't had any sense that they want to send the money back.
Okay, John, to be followed by Malcolm.
Thank you. I mean, there's been some reports showing that the welfare reforms are disproportionately affecting women and children, and I mean, I think we're all committed to the Child Poverty Act, and that's meant to abolish child poverty by 2020. Do the two tie in together?
Well, I think it's often been said in relation to the child poverty debate that the best way that work for many people who can is the best way out of poverty. And that's why the focus of our reforms has been on both strengthening the incentives to work and also strengthening the support for people to get back into work. One recent example which will benefit families across the whole of the UK, including here in Scotland, is the additional support that we'll be making available for childcare costs. That's something which is a significant barrier to entry into the labour market for many families, and it's something which I hope will help to increase labour force participation yet further.
And yet there's a lot of evidence that people in work are also in poverty, and I think the suggestion was there's an extra 1 million people now between the minimum wage and the living wage than there were previously. So work is not always the way out of poverty, is it?
Well, I would be surprised if you didn't accept that for anyone who can, work is the best way to improve someone's position. That's certainly my view. It's the policy of the UK government. I think supporting people into work is also the policy of the Scottish government. But we also need to work to help people both progress in work and also to ensure that the returns to work are fair. And that's why one of the policies that I've been most actively involved in implementing within the UK government, and I'm most proud of as a Liberal Democrat, is the lifting of the income tax personal allowance to £10,000. Precisely ensures that people who are working for low incomes, of whom there are, as you imply, a significant number, are able to keep more of that money for themselves and pay less of it over to the government in income tax.
Okay, Malcolm, to be followed by Michael.
We've only got 8 minutes, so we're a bit restricted. I mean, I would want to challenge some of the things you said there about child poverty and the effect of your childcare changes on lower income families. But let me stick to the discretionary housing payments that you mentioned and try and get all this into one question in case I get cut short. I mean, would you not accept that you need to increase those? Because although I'm totally opposed to the bedroom tax, I understand your arguments in favour of it, but the fact of the matter is in Edinburgh and many other places, the people that you want to move into smaller houses are totally incapable of doing so because there aren't any. So my first question is, should you not be at least increasing discretionary housing payments to those people? But my second point is, we may agree on this, we both want to see further fiscal devolution. I've always supported the devolution of income, of housing benefit, which might deal with the particular problem we're talking about, but would that still be possible with the implementation of universal credit? And if it's not possible, would that not give you some concern, since I suspect you might be favourable to further devolution in that direction as well?
I mean, firstly, the additional discretionary housing payments we provided were based on the evidence that we'd received about the first few months of the spare room subsidy being removed. I think that the sums of money that were provided were what's necessary to ensure that the most difficult cases can be mitigated and therefore the policy can be implemented sensitively. One of the issues that has been particularly drawn to my attention is the particular issues in sparsely populated remote areas, and that's why there was a particular sum of money attached to that. But of course, look, we continue to monitor the implementation, and I know the DWP is in regular discussions with local authorities. I mean, I think that one of the, personally, I am in favour of further devolution in future in the tax area and potentially in other areas too. And as a Liberal Democrat politician, that's a case I will continue to make. I think in the welfare system, though, I think there is a strong argument for a common welfare system across the whole of the UK. It was an argument that was made in the Calman Commission report. Because of the need to maintain, one single labour market across the whole of the United Kingdom. It's not an area where I've particularly advocated further devolution, but it's a perfectly good argument to have.
Okay, Michael, sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much, Convener. It's again around the area of welfare reform. Now, my understanding is that when it comes to issues like sanctions that are imposed against individual benefit claimants, that there would be a penalty should any local authority or the Scottish Government try to find a way of resourcing or mitigating the sanctions that were imposed against someone. But in relation to the bedroom tax, should the Scottish Government from the block grant decide to find an additional sum of money to mitigate the impact of the bedroom tax, would your government consider that to be something that would be worthy of financial penalty against the Scottish Government?
As I said in answer to an earlier question, what the Scottish Government does with its block grant is a matter for the Scottish Government. And so the previous question was, would the block grant be enhanced as a result of policy choices made by the Scottish Government? The answer to that question is no, that the block grant is determined by the Barnett formula. But within that, devolution means that when John Swinney sets out his budget, he's free to determine what the allocations are. In relation to sanctions, though, sanctions are only applied in cases where someone has broken the conditions of their benefit, most particularly in relation to taking the action necessary to try and get back into work. And it is part of, I think, quite properly, the welfare system was one where there is conditionality applied because in the end the system is based on for those who can, and I appreciate there are many people who are not in a position to go into work, but for those who can, there is a strong obligation to do everything they can to get back into work as quickly as possible.
True though, Chief Secretary, is it? Because once a DWP manager makes a decision that someone should be investigated, their benefits stop. If ultimately they're considered that their benefits were an entitlement, then it's looked at again. But the decisions made before an actual, the money stops before an actual decision is made by the DWP. And yet, if a local authority or the Scottish Government wanted to support someone during the period where they're suspended, that the sanctions imposed before an actual decision is made, you penalise them.
Certainly, in my experience as a constituency MP, most of the sanctions that I've come across have been decisions taken, as it were, at the front line based on someone not carrying out the appropriate job search activities. I think that it is reasonable for taxpayers to expect that if benefits are paid on condition that someone actively seeks work, that if they don't do so, then as a last resort, sanctions can be applied.
As a last resort, but is it not the case that the penalty is actually applied before the formal decision is made?
I believe in some cases that can be the case, but I'd have to look at that further.
Final question of the session. It's from Jean.
Clear on the same theme. I'm sure you know it's important. It's one of the most important things happening in Scotland today, the result of the welfare bill. But the mismatch, I just would like to know what you think about the mismatch between the 0 hours contracts and the insecurity that people have in work, contrasted with the extreme rigidity of a welfare system.
I would say that one of the motivations behind the implementation of universal credit, which is, I think, one of the most positive reforms to the welfare system seen in very many years, is that the amount of benefit paid can then be very responsive to the amount of income someone is receiving. The kind of real-time information software that lies behind it does mean that, firstly, if someone is moving from being on benefit to in work, potentially part-time work or low-income work, that rather than seeing a break in their benefits and then having to apply for different benefits and having to wait to get that money paid over, that there is a consistent stream of payments on a monthly basis, that the amount paid can vary according to the income that someone is actually receiving. And therefore, I hope that for the sorts of conditions that you're describing, actually improve and strengthen incentives to work. Because I think that one of the problems going back for years in the welfare system is both that for some people it's often not being clear at all that they'd be better off in work than on benefit, and we need to have a welfare system where everybody is clear that they will be better off in work than on benefit, but also that for people who are only able to work part-time or who the hours fluctuate, that can create real administrative difficulties, constantly having to go back with new information and so on, that the universal credit will really transform that environment. So I hope that the universal credit, it's going to come to the Inverness Job Centre in the Highlands in the autumn. And I hope that I certainly will, hope you will too, spend a bit of time examining actually how it's working, because I hope that you will see that it's something which is a positive change for both for work incentives and for the individuals themselves.
Thank you very much for that, Jean. We're on time.
Thank you very much.
It's 10:31. I'd like to thank the Chief Secretary for his evidence today, and indeed colleagues for their questions, particularly the last lot, which were very brief, concise and to the point. And I hope very much not only that you catch your flight, but that we see you again at the Finance Committee before too long. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time and for meeting my timetable. And I look forward to coming back soon.
That basically ends the public part of the meeting, as we agreed to take the next two items in private. So I'll now call an adjournment to 10:40, and then we'll move into private session.